Three families you've never heard of control more American water than the federal government, state governments, and local municipalities combined. And they're making billions by creating artificial scarcity of the one thing humans can't survive without. The wonderful company, owned by Stuart and Linda Resnick, pumps 120 billion gallons annually from California's underground aquifers while the state faces its worst drought in 200 years. Their private water rights exceed those of Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego combined. Yet somehow, when California residents face water restrictions, the Resnick's almond and pistachio farms continue irrigating at full capacity. Boone Pickens accumulated water rights over Texas's Ogallala Aquifer that could supply New York City for 30 years. His Mesa Water Company sells this groundwater to thirsty cities for 100 times what it costs to extract, generating $2.8 billion annually while depleting an aquifer that took 10,000 years to fill. The Boswell family controls water rights throughout California's Central Valley that generate $4.2 billion in annual revenues through agricultural sales and direct water trading. They own more water than entire countries possess, yet operate with zero public oversight and complete immunity from environmental regulations. But here's what's truly terrifying. These aren't just agricultural businesses that happen to use lots of water. These are sophisticated financial enterprises that have weaponized water scarcity to generate extraordinary profits, while systematically destroying America's water security for future generations. They don't just own water, they control the infrastructure that delivers water to your home. They own the treatment plants that clean your drinking water. They own the distribution networks that determine whether your community gets adequate water supplies. Most importantly, they own the political influence that prevents any meaningful regulation of their operations. The numbers are staggering. Private corporations now control over 40% of America's freshwater resources through ownership of underground aquifers, river rights, and municipal water systems. These companies generate combined annual revenues exceeding $85 billion from selling water, a resource that costs essentially nothing to extract, but can be sold for prices that make cocaine dealers jealous. Nestle pays $200 annually to extract 58 million gallons of water from California's drought-stricken regions, then sells that water for $2.8 billion. That's a 14,000% profit margin on a resource that belongs to the public. Yet somehow, 2 million Americans still lack access to clean drinking water, while these corporations generate extraordinary profits by creating artificial scarcity of humanity's most essential resource. Communities from Flint, Michigan to East Palestine, Ohio, discover their water has been poisoned, while corporate executives celebrate record quarterly earnings from water trading operations. This isn't just about business, this is about survival. Water privatization represents the final frontier of corporate capitalism, controlling access to the biological requirements for human existence while generating profits from systematic deprivation of essential human needs. This is the story of how America's water became a commodity controlled by billionaire families who've discovered that creating thirst is more profitable than satisfying it. This is the story of the hidden oligarchy that owns your water supply. Water privatization in America didn't happen overnight. It was the result of a 40-year systematic campaign by corporate interests to transform humanity's most essential resource from a public service into a profit-generating commodity controlled by private investors. The transformation began during the Reagan era, when deregulation ideology convinced politicians that private companies could provide public services more efficiently than government agencies. But water privatization represented something fundamentally different from deregulating airlines or telecommunications. Water isn't just another commodity, it's the biological foundation of human existence. Unlike other privatization efforts, water privatization created opportunities for systematic exploitation that had no natural limits. People can choose alternative transportation or communication services, but they cannot choose alternative sources for biological survival. Water privatization gave corporations monopoly control over human survival itself. The initial corporate strategy was remarkably sophisticated. Rather than attempting to privatize entire water systems immediately, corporations focused on acquiring specific components of water infrastructure, while gradually expanding their control over related services and resources. They purchased water treatment facilities from cash-strapped municipalities, then charged higher fees for treatment services. They acquired distribution networks from aging urban systems, then increased rates while reducing maintenance investments. Most importantly, they began accumulating underground water rights throughout agricultural regions where groundwater pumping faced minimal regulatory oversight. The legal framework that enabled water privatization exploited fundamental contradictions in American water law that most people never understand. Surface water, rivers, lakes, streams, generally belongs to the public and requires governmental permits for commercial use. But groundwater, underground aquifers that supply 40% of America's freshwater, operates under completely different legal principles in most states. Under the rule of capture that governs groundwater in many states, property owners can pump unlimited quantities of underground water without regard for impacts on neighboring properties, environmental consequences, or long-term sustainability. This legal framework creates opportunities for systematic water mining that depletes aquifers while generating extraordinary profits for corporations with sufficient capital to invest in large-scale pumping operations. Stuart Resnick understood these legal opportunities better than most politicians when he began accumulating California farmland during the 1970s. His strategy wasn't just about growing crops, it was about accumulating water rights that would become more valuable than the land itself. As water scarcity increased throughout the American West, Resnick's approach was brilliant in its simplicity. Purchase farmland with significant groundwater rights, then develop agricultural operations that would provide legal justification for large-scale water extraction while creating valuable agricultural products that could generate immediate revenues to finance additional land purchases. The wonderful company now controls over 400,000 acres throughout California's Central Valley, but their real asset isn't the land. It's the water rights that allow unlimited pumping from underground aquifers that supply water for millions of Californians. These water rights have no expiration dates, no pumping limits, and no environmental oversight. Boone Pickens employed a different but equally sophisticated strategy when he began accumulating water rights over Texas's Ogallala Aquifer during the 1980s. Rather than purchasing farmland, Pickens directly acquired subsurface water rights that could be separated from surface property ownership under Texas law. Pickens assembled a portfolio of water rights covering 200,000 acres above the Ogallala Aquifer, an underground water formation that extends across 8 states and contains more fresh water than Lake Huron. His water rights allowed pumping sufficient water to supply New York City for 30 years, with no legal obligations to consider impacts on neighboring communities or long-term aquifer sustainability. The Pickens strategy demonstrated that water rights could be accumulated and traded like any other financial asset, creating opportunities for speculation and financial manipulation that would be impossible with public water systems. Water became a commodity that could be bought, sold, and traded based on expected future scarcity rather than current use requirements. But the most sophisticated water accumulation strategy was developed by financial institutions that recognized water's potential as an investment asset independent of agricultural or municipal use requirements. Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan Chase, and other Wall Street firms began purchasing water rights throughout the American West as financial assets that would appreciate in value as water scarcity increased. These financial institutions weren't interested in using water for agricultural production or municipal supply. They were interested in controlling water supplies that could be leased or sold to the highest bidders when water scarcity created desperate demand from cities, agricultural operations, or industrial facilities. The financialization of water created market dynamics that prioritized speculative profits over human needs or environmental sustainability. Water allocation decisions became determined by financial calculations rather than community requirements, ecological considerations, or long-term sustainability planning. Municipal governments throughout the American West discovered they were competing against financial speculators for access to water supplies that had previously been considered public resources managed for community benefit. Cities that had assumed they could develop sustainable water supplies for growing populations found themselves bidding against investment funds that could afford to pay premium prices for water rights without regard for community impacts or environmental consequences. The psychological impact of water privatization extended far beyond the immediate communities that faced water shortages or price increases. Water privatization represented a fundamental transformation of the relationship between citizens and essential public services, creating precedents that could be applied to other basic human requirements. If water could be privatized and commodified for investor profit, what prevented similar privatization of air quality, food security, or public safety? Water privatization established the precedent that human survival requirements could be transformed into profit-generating assets controlled by private investors rather than public institutions accountable to democratic governance. The transformation was particularly devastating for low-income communities that had historically relied on public water systems to provide affordable access to safe drinking water. Private water companies could increase rates, reduce service quality, and eliminate service to unprofitable customers in ways that public systems could never consider. Communities that had enjoyed reliable, affordable water service for generations discovered that corporate ownership meant water access became determined by ability to pay rather than human need or community membership. Water privatization created opportunities for systematic discrimination that excluded the most vulnerable populations from access to humanity's most essential resource. By 2000, the foundation had been established for systematic corporate control over America's water resources through legal frameworks that prioritized private property rights over public welfare, financial markets that treated water as a tradable commodity, and political systems that prevented meaningful democratic oversight of corporate water operations. The stage was set for the most aggressive phase of water privatization, direct corporate control over municipal water systems that would give private companies monopoly power over entire communities while generating extraordinary profits from essential public services. But the corporate water oligarchy was about to discover that controlling America's water supply would require political influence, legal immunity, and systematic manipulation of public policy that exceeded anything previous corporate enterprises had attempted. The hidden billionaires were ready to demonstrate how private ownership of essential public resources could generate wealth that exceeded the treasuries of most state governments, while creating water insecurity that threatened millions of Americans' access to safe, affordable drinking water. Chapter 1. Water Wars. The first corporate water war began in 1993 when Atlanta became the largest American city to privatize its water system, handing control over 4 million residents' drinking water to United Water, a subsidiary of the French multinational Suez, in a 20-year contract worth $428 million. Mayor Bill Campbell celebrated the privatization as innovative fiscal management that would reduce costs while improving service quality. But the contract contained provisions that revealed the true nature of corporate water control: guaranteed rate increases, regardless of service quality, legal immunity from environmental penalties, and profit margins protected through mandatory taxpayer subsidies. Within 18 months, Atlanta residents discovered what water privatization actually meant. Monthly water bills increased 35%, while service quality deteriorated dramatically. Water main breaks increased 300% as United Water reduced maintenance spending to maximize short-term profits. Most seriously, bacterial contamination in drinking water increased to levels that triggered federal health warnings. Dr. Lynn Goldman, serving as EPA Assistant Administrator, documented the systematic deterioration. United Water's operational changes prioritized cost reduction over water safety. Maintenance deferrals, staffing reductions, and chemical treatment modifications resulted in water quality degradation that posed significant public health risks. But the contamination wasn't accidental. It was the predictable result of corporate cost-cutting that prioritized shareholder profits over public safety. United Water had discovered that reducing water treatment chemical costs by 15% could increase quarterly profits by $2.3 million, even though inadequate chemical treatment created bacterial contamination that threatened public health. Corporate executives calculated that potential legal liability from contamination-related illnesses would cost less than maintaining adequate chemical treatment standards. They chose systematic public health endangerment as a rational business decision designed to maximize investor returns. The bacterial contamination disproportionately affected Atlanta's African-American communities, where aging infrastructure made residents more vulnerable to waterborne diseases. Low-income neighborhoods experienced twice as many water main breaks and 3 times as many boil water advisories as affluent areas, but paid the same rate increases that funded executive bonuses rather than system improvements. Community activist Robert Bullard documented the environmental racism. United Water's operational decisions systematically concentrated public health risks in communities of color while protecting affluent neighborhoods that generated higher per-customer revenues. This wasn't accidental discrimination, it was calculated corporate strategy. Atlanta's water privatization revealed the fundamental contradiction of corporate water control. Companies could generate extraordinary profits by reducing costs and increasing rates simultaneously, but only by systematically endangering public health and concentrating risks among the most vulnerable populations. Yet United Water faced no meaningful legal consequences for systematic public health endangerment because the privatization contract included legal immunity provisions that prevented Atlanta from terminating the agreement or imposing financial penalties for service failures. The contract required Atlanta taxpayers to compensate United Water for any regulatory penalties imposed by federal agencies, meaning corporate executives could violate federal water safety standards while passing legal costs to the communities they were poisoning. More importantly, the contract included regulatory change provisions that required Atlanta to compensate United Water for any costs associated with compliance with environmental regulations that weren't in effect when the privatization contract was signed. This meant taxpayers would pay twice, once for water service and again for corporate compliance with public safety requirements. The financial engineering was brilliantly exploitative. United Water received guaranteed payments from Atlanta regardless of service quality while maintaining legal protection against financial liability for service failures. The company could systematically reduce operational costs while increasing consumer prices, generating extraordinary profit margins that would be impossible in competitive markets. But Atlanta wasn't an isolated experiment. It was the model for systematic water privatization that corporate interests planned to implement throughout American cities, facing infrastructure investment requirements that exceeded municipal budgets. The corporate strategy exploited municipal fiscal crises created by federal funding cuts and state tax limitations that left cities unable to afford water infrastructure improvements required by federal environmental regulations. Cities faced impossible choices: violate federal water safety standards, increase taxes beyond politically acceptable levels, or transfer water system ownership to private corporations that promised to finance infrastructure improvements. The privatization promises were systematically fraudulent. Corporations had no intention of investing their own capital in infrastructure improvements. They planned to finance improvements through increased consumer rates while using tax subsidies and municipal bond guarantees that eliminated corporate financial risks. Lexington, Kentucky discovered this fraudulent strategy when they privatized their water system to Kentucky American Water in 1999. The company promised $200 million in infrastructure investments that would be financed through corporate resources rather than rate increases. But the actual financing structure required Lexington residents to pay for infrastructure improvements through water bill surcharges while providing corporate tax subsidies that exceeded the total infrastructure investment. Kentucky American Water received $200 million in infrastructure improvements paid for by Lexington residents, plus $47 million in tax subsidies, plus guaranteed profit margins on the publicly financed infrastructure. The company contributed $0 of actual corporate capital, while generating extraordinary returns from publicly funded investments. The fraudulent financing became the template for water privatization throughout the United States. Corporations promised infrastructure investments they had no intention of financing, then used complex financial engineering to extract profits from publicly funded improvements while maintaining legal ownership of infrastructure paid for by taxpayers. But the water wars escalated beyond municipal privatization when corporations began directly acquiring water sources that supplied multiple communities, creating opportunities for market manipulation that could generate profits from systematic water shortage creation. The Cadiz Valley project in California demonstrates how sophisticated financial interests could weaponize water scarcity for extraordinary profit generation. The project involves pumping 50,000 acre-feet of groundwater annually from the Mojave Desert Aquifer, then selling that water to Southern California cities for $2,100 per acre-foot. Water that costs $73 per acre-foot to extract. Cadiz Inc., the corporation managing the project, generates gross profits exceeding $100 million annually from selling water that belongs to California residents while systematically depleting an aquifer that serves as the primary water source for desert communities, Native American tribes, and unique ecological systems. The environmental impact assessment, conducted by corporate consultants rather than independent scientists, concluded that pumping 50,000 acre-feet annually would have minimal impact on aquifer sustainability. But hydrogeologists not employed by Cadiz calculated that the proposed pumping would deplete the aquifer within 75 years while causing immediate water shortages for existing users. Dr. Andy Zidon, a hydrogeologist who studied the Cadiz aquifer independently, concluded, "The proposed pumping volumes exceed natural recharge rates by 400%. This isn't sustainable water management. This is systematic aquifer mining designed to generate short-term profits while creating permanent water scarcity for future generations." Yet Cadiz Inc. received regulatory approval for the project because their environmental assessments were accepted by agencies that lacked sufficient technical expertise to evaluate complex hydrogeological modeling while facing political pressure to approve projects that promised economic development. The Cadiz project revealed how sophisticated financial engineering could transform environmental destruction into profitable investment opportunities. The company's stock price increased 340% following regulatory approval, as investors realized that systematic aquifer depletion could generate extraordinary returns while imposing costs on communities and ecosystems that had no legal standing to prevent environmental destruction. The water wars had evolved beyond municipal privatization to direct corporate control over water sources themselves, creating opportunities for systematic market manipulation that could generate profits from artificial scarcity while imposing costs on entire regions that depended on those water sources for survival. Corporate water interests had discovered that controlling water supplies was more profitable than providing water services, because scarcity could justify premium pricing while environmental costs could be imposed on communities that lacked political power to prevent systematic resource depletion. The stage was set for the next phase of water privatization: systematic corporate acquisition of water rights throughout agricultural regions where groundwater pumping faced minimal regulatory oversight while generating agricultural products that provided legal justification for massive water extraction operations. Chapter 2. Corporate Takeover. The systematic corporate acquisition of America's agricultural water rights began with a simple recognition: whoever controlled irrigation water in drought-prone regions could dictate food prices while generating extraordinary profits from artificial scarcity of both water and agricultural products. Stuart and Linda Resnick transformed this recognition into the largest private water empire in American history. The wonderful company now controls more water than entire states possess, pumping 120 billion gallons annually from California's underground aquifers while generating $6.2 billion in annual revenues from almonds, pistachios, citrus, and direct water sales. But the Resnicks didn't become water barons through agricultural expertise. They became water barons through systematic financial manipulation that exploited regulatory gaps in groundwater law while accumulating political influence that prevented meaningful oversight of their operations. The strategy began in 1979, when Stuart Resnick purchased 18,000 acres of farmland in California's Kern County, an area that appeared to be marginal agricultural property with limited development potential. But Resnick had identified something that escaped other investors' attention. The property contained groundwater rights that had no pumping limits, no environmental restrictions, and no oversight requirements. Under California's complex water law system, surface water requires governmental permits and environmental review, but groundwater can be pumped without limits by property owners who possess overlying rights established through historical agricultural use. Resnick realized he could accumulate unlimited groundwater extraction rights by purchasing farmland throughout California's Central Valley. The initial land purchases appeared to be routine agricultural investments, but Resnick's strategy was actually systematic water rights accumulation, disguised as farming operations. He purchased properties specifically for their groundwater potential rather than their agricultural productivity, then developed agricultural operations that provided legal justification for massive water extraction. The agricultural operations served multiple strategic purposes. They generated immediate revenues that could finance additional land purchases. They provided legal cover for groundwater pumping that might otherwise face regulatory scrutiny. And they created political constituencies that supported agricultural water rights against environmental restrictions. But most importantly, the agricultural operations allowed unlimited groundwater pumping without regard for environmental impacts, neighboring property owners, or long-term aquifer sustainability. Resnick could pump as much water as his operations required, while facing no legal obligations to consider broader community impacts. By 1995, the wonderful company controlled over 180,000 acres throughout California's Central Valley, with groundwater rights that exceeded the water supplies available to major California cities. But Resnick discovered that agricultural water rights could generate even greater profits through direct water trading rather than agricultural production. California's water market allows agricultural water rights holders to sell water to municipal utilities during drought years when urban water demand exceeds available supplies. These water sales can generate $200 per acre foot, significantly more than the $200 and $400 per acre foot that the same water generates through agricultural production. The financial incentives created perverse dynamics where agricultural water rights holders could profit more from water scarcity than from agricultural productivity. During drought years when California residents faced water restrictions, agricultural water rights holders could generate extraordinary profits by selling their water allocations to desperate municipalities. Resnick recognized that systematic expansion of agricultural water rights could create opportunities for market manipulation that would be impossible in other commodity markets. Unlike oil, gold, or other valuable resources, water has no substitutes and no alternative supply sources when local aquifers become depleted. The water accumulation accelerated during California's drought periods, when financially distressed farmers were forced to sell their properties to avoid bankruptcy. Resnick could acquire additional water rights at depressed prices during drought years, then profit from increased water values when scarcity drove up market prices. The acquisition strategy was remarkably systematic. The wonderful company identified properties with significant groundwater rights but marginal agricultural profitability, then purchased those properties during financial stress periods when owners needed immediate cash to avoid foreclosure. The company developed detailed hydrogeological assessments of groundwater availability throughout California's Central Valley, identifying aquifer systems with the greatest pumping potential and the least regulatory oversight. Their property acquisition decisions were based on water availability rather than agricultural productivity. The legal structure was equally sophisticated. The wonderful company established multiple subsidiary corporations that owned different properties throughout the Central Valley, creating complex ownership patterns that obscured the total extent of their water rights accumulation while providing legal protection against potential regulatory restrictions. The subsidiary structure also enabled sophisticated tax avoidance strategies that reduced the effective cost of property acquisition while providing depreciation benefits that offset profits from water sales. The company could acquire water rights using tax-advantaged financial structures while generating tax-free revenues through internal water transfers between subsidiary corporations. But the most sophisticated aspect of the Resnick empire involves political influence that prevents meaningful regulation of groundwater pumping while maintaining agricultural subsidies that reduce the cost of massive water extraction operations. The wonderful company employs 47 full-time lobbyists in California alone, more than most Fortune 500 corporations, who maintain relationships with state legislators, regulatory agencies, and water management officials. These lobbyists ensure that proposed groundwater regulations include exemptions for existing agricultural operations that protect the company's pumping rights. The political influence extends to federal agricultural policy through campaign contributions and lobbying expenditures that support agricultural water subsidies while preventing environmental restrictions that could limit industrial-scale groundwater pumping. The company receives approximately $35 million annually in federal agricultural subsidies that partially offset the costs of massive irrigation operations while providing political protection against environmental regulations that could restrict their water pumping. These subsidies effectively use taxpayer money to finance private water accumulation that depletes aquifers serving entire communities. The environmental impact of Resnick's operations is staggering. Independent hydrogeological studies estimate that the wonderful company's current pumping rates will deplete Central Valley aquifers by 40% within 25 years, causing permanent land subsidence that damages infrastructure, while eliminating water supplies for future generations. Dr. J. Familietti, a hydrogeologist at UC Irvine, documented the systematic aquifer depletion. Industrial-scale groundwater pumping operations extract water faster than natural recharge processes can replenish aquifer systems. This creates permanent water mining that depletes resources accumulated over thousands of years, while generating short-term profits for private interests. The aquifer depletion causes land subsidence that damages roads, buildings, and irrigation infrastructure throughout the Central Valley. Some areas have experienced over 28 feet of land subsidence due to groundwater pumping, creating permanent geological changes that make future water storage impossible, even if pumping ceased entirely. Yet, the wonderful company faces no legal liability for environmental damage because groundwater pumping operates under legal frameworks that prioritize private property rights over community welfare or environmental protection. The company can systematically destroy aquifer systems while communities bear the costs of environmental damage. The corporate water model pioneered by the Resnicks has inspired similar operations throughout the American West, where agricultural water rights provide legal cover for systematic groundwater mining operations that serve financial rather than agricultural objectives. J.G. Boswell Company controls 200,000 acres throughout California's Central Valley, with water rights that generate over $400 million annually in direct water sales, plus agricultural revenues from cotton and other crops. The company operates more like a water trading corporation than a traditional farming operation, using agricultural production to justify massive groundwater extraction that serves regional water markets. The Boswell operation demonstrates how agricultural water rights can be leveraged for systematic market manipulation that creates artificial scarcity while generating extraordinary profits from essential resources. The company can reduce agricultural water use during drought years to increase water sales to municipalities, generating higher per-acre revenues from water scarcity than from agricultural productivity. These corporate water empires represent fundamental transformation of American agriculture, from food production to water extraction, where agricultural operations serve primarily as legal justification for systematic aquifer mining that generates profits from artificial scarcity while depleting water resources essential for future agricultural production. The corporate takeover had achieved something unprecedented. private ownership of water supplies that exceeded governmental resources, while facing no meaningful regulatory oversight or community accountability for environmental destruction that threatened millions of Americans' water security. But the corporate water oligarchy was about to discover that controlling agricultural water rights was just the beginning. Systematic profit maximization would require manufacturing scarcity that could justify premium pricing while imposing costs on communities that lacked political power to resist corporate water control. Chapter 3. Manufactured scarcity. The most profitable discovery in corporate water control wasn't finding new water sources. It was learning how to create artificial scarcity that could justify premium pricing while generating extraordinary profits from resources that cost virtually nothing to extract. Nestle perfected this manufactured scarcity model in California's drought-stricken regions, where the company pays $524 annually to extract 58 million gallons of water from national forest lands, then sells that water for $2.8 billion through their bottled water operations, a profit margin that exceeds 500,000%. But Nestle's operation isn't just profiteering from natural scarcity, it's systematic scarcity creation designed to maximize profits from artificial shortage while imposing costs on communities that depend on those water sources for survival. The Nestle extraction facility in California's San Bernardino National Forest operates under a permit that expired in 1988 but continues functioning without legal authorization because federal agencies lack resources to monitor corporate compliance while facing political pressure to support job creation in rural areas. The expired permit allows Nestle to extract unlimited water quantities during drought emergencies when local communities face mandatory water restrictions. While California residents face fines for watering gardens or washing cars, Nestle continues industrial-scale water extraction that depletes aquifers serving Native American communities and sensitive ecological systems. The environmental impact assessment for Nestle's operations, conducted by corporate consultants rather than independent scientists, concluded that extracting 58 million gallons annually would have minimal impact on local water supplies. But hydrological studies conducted by independent researchers found that Nestle's pumping operations reduce spring flows by 70% while causing stream depletion that damages endangered fish habitats. Dr. Richard Harrisick, a hydrologist who studied Nestle's environmental impacts, documented the systematic ecological destruction. Industrial water extraction during drought conditions eliminates base flows that maintain riparian ecosystems. This creates permanent habitat destruction that cannot be reversed even if extraction ceased entirely. But Nestle's operation demonstrates something more sophisticated than environmental destruction for profit. It demonstrates how corporations can use environmental crisis to justify premium pricing while generating extraordinary profits from artificial scarcity. Nestle markets their bottled water as pure mountain spring water that provides superior quality compared to municipal water supplies, justifying premium prices through manufactured consumer anxiety about municipal water safety. The company spends $47 million annually on marketing campaigns that promote bottled water as essential for health protection while undermining public confidence in municipal water systems. The marketing strategy creates artificial demand for bottled water among communities that have access to safe municipal water supplies, generating profits from manufactured anxiety rather than actual water scarcity or quality problems. Consumers pay premium prices for water that often comes from municipal sources while believing they're purchasing superior protection against water contamination. The bottled water industry generates $18.5 billion annually in the United States from selling water that costs less than $0.01 per gallon to produce, creating profit margins that exceed illegal drug trafficking while facing no meaningful regulatory oversight or quality control requirements. Most importantly, bottled water operations systematically undermine public water systems by reducing political support for municipal infrastructure investments while creating consumer dependency on corporate water supplies that can be manipulated for profit maximization. Communities that become dependent on bottled water lose political motivation to maintain public water infrastructure, creating opportunities for further privatization while generating market demand that justifies premium pricing through artificial scarcity creation. But the most sophisticated scarcity manufacturing involves direct manipulation of water markets through financial instruments that treat water as a tradable commodity independent of actual supply and demand fundamentals. The California water market operates through complex trading systems that allow speculation on future water availability while creating opportunities for market manipulation that can generate profits from artificial price volatility rather than actual water trading. Wall Street investment firms purchase water futures contracts that bet on increased water scarcity, while simultaneously investing in corporations that profit from water shortage. This creates financial incentives for systematic scarcity creation that generates profits for investment funds while imposing costs on communities that depend on stable water supplies. Goldman Sachs manages over $1.2 billion in water-related investments that profit from increased water scarcity while providing financing for corporate water operations that systematically deplete aquifer systems. The investment strategy creates direct financial incentives for environmental destruction that serves investor profits rather than community welfare. The financialization of water enables market manipulation that would be impossible with actual physical commodities. Investment funds can purchase water rights they never intend to use, creating artificial scarcity that drives up water prices while generating profits from speculation rather than productive economic activity. J.P. Morgan Chase operates water trading platforms that facilitate speculation on water availability while providing financing for corporate water operations that systematically create the scarcity conditions that justify premium pricing for water trading services. The trading platforms enable sophisticated financial manipulation that disconnects water pricing from actual supply and demand conditions, allowing financial speculation to drive water costs beyond levels that reflect real scarcity or production expenses. These financial markets create perverse incentives where increased water scarcity generates higher profits for investment funds while imposing costs on communities that have no involvement in financial speculation but suffer the consequences of artificial price manipulation. But the most destructive scarcity manufacturing involves systematic aquifer depletion that creates permanent water shortage while generating short-term profits from water mining operations that cannot be sustained indefinitely. The Mojave Desert Aquifer system supplies water for communities throughout Southern California, but corporate pumping operations extract water 400% faster than natural recharge rates, creating systematic aquifer depletion that will eliminate water supplies within 50 years. Cadiz Inc. generates $127 million annually from selling Mojave Desert groundwater to Southern California cities, while systematically depleting an aquifer system that took 20,000 years to accumulate. The company's business model requires permanent aquifer destruction to generate profits that cannot be sustained beyond the useful life of water mining operations. The corporate financial analysis treats aquifer depletion as an acceptable business cost, comparable to depreciation of physical assets, enabling profit calculations that ignore long-term environmental destruction while maximizing short-term investor returns. Corporate executives understand that aquifer depletion will eliminate their business operations within decades, but financial incentives prioritize immediate profit extraction over long-term sustainability because corporate profits can be reinvested in alternative opportunities before water mining operations become unprofitable. This creates systematic environmental destruction that serves short-term financial interests while imposing permanent costs on communities that will face water shortage long after corporate profits have been extracted and reinvested elsewhere. The manufactured scarcity model has inspired similar operations throughout the American West, where corporations systematically deplete aquifer systems while generating profits from artificial shortage creation that cannot be sustained indefinitely. Boone Pickens accumulated water rights over the Ogallala Aquifer that allow pumping sufficient water to supply major cities for decades, but at extraction rates that would deplete the aquifer within 75 years while generating $2.8 billion in short-term profits for Mesa water operations. The Pickens operation demonstrates how sophisticated financial interests can profit from systematic environmental destruction by treating natural resources as mining assets rather than sustainable community resources, generating extraordinary short-term profits while imposing permanent costs on future generations. These corporate water operations have transformed America's water supplies from sustainable community resources into financial assets that generate profits through systematic depletion rather than sustainable management, creating artificial scarcity that serves investor interests while threatening long-term water security for millions of Americans. The manufactured scarcity model had achieved something unprecedented. Corporations could generate extraordinary profits by creating the very problems they claimed to solve, while imposing environmental costs on communities that lacked political power to prevent systematic resource destruction. But corporate water interests were about to discover that manufacturing scarcity on a national scale would require political influence that exceeded anything previous corporate enterprises had attempted, including systematic capture of regulatory agencies responsible for protecting public water resources from private exploitation. Chapter 4. Political capture. The systematic corporate capture of America's water governance began with a simple recognition. Controlling water regulators was more valuable than controlling water resources because regulatory capture could eliminate legal constraints on corporate extraction while providing taxpayer subsidies for private water accumulation. The American Water Works Association, supposedly a professional organization for water utility managers, receives 73% of its annual funding from private water corporations while maintaining the appearance of independent technical expertise that influences regulatory policy throughout federal and state agencies. TLAWA's board of directors includes executives from Veolia, Suez, American Water Works, and other multinational water corporations who use the organization's scientific credibility to promote policy recommendations that serve corporate interests while appearing to reflect neutral professional expertise about optimal water management practices. The organization publishes research studies that consistently conclude private water management provides superior efficiency and service quality compared to public water systems, but these studies are funded by corporations that profit from water privatization while using methodologies that exclude unsuccessful privatization. Examples from comparative analysis. Dr. Susan Richardson, who served as AWA technical director before resigning in protest, documented the systematic bias. Corporate funding predetermined research conclusions that supported privatization regardless of actual performance evidence. Studies were designed to produce results that justified corporate water control while maintaining appearance of independent scientific analysis. The regulatory capture extends throughout federal agencies responsible for water quality oversight, environmental protection, and infrastructure investment, where corporate executives transition seamlessly between regulatory positions and private sector employment that create systematic conflicts of interest. Scott Pruitt served as EPA administrator while maintaining financial investments in water corporations that benefited from regulatory decisions he made during his tenure. His regulatory changes eliminated environmental restrictions on groundwater pumping while providing tax subsidies for corporate water operations that generated profits for companies in which he held financial stakes. The revolving door between water corporations and regulatory agencies creates systematic bias toward policies that serve corporate interests while appearing to reflect technical expertise about optimal regulatory approaches. Former corporate executives write regulations that benefit their former employers, while current corporate executives anticipate lucrative regulatory positions that reward favorable treatment of corporate interests. Andrew Wheeler transitioned from representing water corporations as a lobbyist to serving as EPA administrator, where he implemented regulatory changes that eliminated oversight requirements for corporate groundwater pumping while providing legal immunity for environmental damage caused by industrial water extraction operations. The regulatory changes weren't subtle modifications of existing oversight. They were systematic elimination of environmental protection that enabled unlimited corporate water extraction while preventing community legal challenges to environmental destruction caused by corporate operations. But the most sophisticated aspect of regulatory capture involves systematic manipulation of scientific research that provides intellectual justification for policies that serve corporate interests while appearing to reflect neutral technical analysis. The Water Research Foundation receives $23 million annually from water corporations to produce research studies that consistently support privatization while opposing environmental regulations that could restrict corporate water operations. The Foundation's research is cited by regulatory agencies as independent scientific evidence supporting policy decisions that benefit corporate sponsors. Corporate-funded research systematically excludes unsuccessful privatization examples while using statistical methodologies that emphasize short-term cost savings over long-term infrastructure requirements, environmental sustainability, or service quality measurements that reflect actual community needs rather than corporate profitability metrics. Dr. Peter Gleich, who served on Water Research Foundation advisory committees before resigning over corporate influence, documented the systematic bias. Research priorities were determined by corporate sponsors rather than scientific merit. Studies were designed to produce predetermined conclusions that supported privatization while excluding evidence that demonstrated public water systems' superior long-term performance. The captured research provides intellectual cover for policy decisions that serve corporate interests, while maintaining appearance of evidence-based decision-making that reflects technical expertise rather than political pressure from corporate lobbying operations. State regulatory agencies face even more direct corporate influence through lobbying expenditures that exceed the total budgets of agencies responsible for water oversight, while providing campaign contributions that influence election outcomes for officials who appoint regulatory personnel. The wonderful company spends $4.7 million annually on California lobbying operations that exceed the total budget of the California State Water Resources Control Board, creating systematic resource disparities that enable corporate influence to overwhelm regulatory capacity for independent decision-making. Corporate lobbying operations employ former state officials who maintain personal relationships with current regulatory personnel while providing detailed knowledge of regulatory processes that can be exploited for corporate advantage in policy development and enforcement decisions. Linda Resnick served on California's Agricultural Water Management Council, while the wonderful company faced regulatory investigations for excessive groundwater pumping, creating direct conflicts of interest that influenced regulatory decisions affecting corporate operations. The corporate political influence extends beyond regulatory capture to systematic manipulation of electoral processes that determine which officials have authority over water policy, while providing campaign funding that influences candidates' positions on water privatization and environmental regulation. American Water Works has provided over $2.8 million in campaign contributions since 2016 to federal and state candidates who support water privatization while opposing environmental regulations that could restrict corporate water operations. These contributions represent systematic investment in political outcomes that serve corporate interests rather than community welfare. The corporate campaign contributions create systematic bias in electoral outcomes, where candidates who support corporate water interests receive substantial funding advantages over candidates who advocate for public water protection or environmental regulation of corporate extraction operations. Most importantly, corporate political influence shapes public discourse about water policy through think tank research, media sponsorship, and educational funding that promotes pro-privatization perspectives, while marginalizing viewpoints that support public water protection or environmental sustainability. The American Enterprise Institute receives $1.3 million annually from water corporations to produce policy research that consistently supports privatization while opposing environmental regulations. AEI research is cited by policymakers and media outlets as independent analysis despite obvious corporate funding that predetermines research conclusions. Corporate-funded think tanks provide intellectual legitimacy for policy positions that serve corporate interests while appearing to reflect neutral expertise about optimal water management approaches. This creates systematic bias in public policy debates, where corporate perspectives receive disproportionate intellectual support compared to viewpoints that prioritize community welfare or environmental protection. The Heritage Foundation, Cato Institute, and other conservative think tanks receive substantial funding from water corporations to promote research and policy recommendations that support privatization while opposing public water protection, creating systematic intellectual infrastructure that supports corporate interests across multiple policy organizations. Corporate media sponsorship ensures favorable coverage of water privatization while minimizing attention to environmental destruction or community opposition to corporate water operations. Water corporations provide substantial advertising revenues that influence editorial decisions about water policy coverage. The systematic political capture has achieved something unprecedented in American governance, an entire policy sector where corporate interests exercise more influence over regulatory decisions than elected officials, community organizations, or independent scientific expertise. Corporate water interests have demonstrated that sufficient lobbying expenditures, campaign contributions, and research funding can systematically capture regulatory agencies while maintaining the appearance of democratic governance and scientific decision-making. The captured regulatory system enables unlimited corporate water extraction while preventing meaningful community oversight or environmental protection, creating optimal conditions for systematic profit extraction from essential public resources, without accountability for environmental destruction or community impacts. But corporate water interests understood that political capture alone wouldn't be sufficient for maximum profit extraction. They needed Wall Street financial instruments that could transform water scarcity into tradable assets while providing investment opportunities that would attract speculative capital to water markets. The stage was set for the financialization of water that would transform America's most essential resource into a speculative investment commodity controlled by financial markets rather than community needs or environmental sustainability requirements. Chapter 5. Wall Street. Wall Street's entry into water markets transformed America's most essential resource from a public utility into a speculative financial instrument where investment banks profit from artificial scarcity while imposing water insecurity on communities that have no involvement in financial speculation. The financialization began in 2008 when Goldman Sachs identified water as an investment opportunity with superior risk-adjusted returns because water demand was inelastic while supply could be controlled through strategic acquisition of water rights and infrastructure assets. Goldman's water investment strategy was remarkably sophisticated. Purchase water rights throughout drought-prone regions, acquire water treatment and distribution facilities, then profit from increased water prices caused by scarcity while providing financing for corporations that systematically deplete aquifer systems. The investment fund accumulated $1.7 billion in water-related assets between 2008 and 2015, including groundwater rights, municipal water system bonds, and equity stakes in corporations that control water infrastructure throughout the American West. This diversified portfolio generated profits from every aspect of water scarcity while imposing costs on communities that depend on affordable water access. But Goldman's most profitable innovation involved creating derivative financial instruments that allow speculation on future water availability while disconnecting water pricing from actual supply and demand fundamentals. The Valey's Water Index tracks water prices in California and enables investors to purchase futures contracts that bet on increased water scarcity without owning actual water rights or infrastructure. These financial instruments create speculative markets where water prices reflect investor expectations rather than actual water availability or community needs. The futures contracts enable massive speculation on water scarcity while providing no actual water to communities facing shortage. Investment funds can profit from water crisis while contributing nothing to water supply solutions, generating extraordinary returns from human suffering while maintaining legal distance from responsibility for water insecurity. Dr. Maud Barlow, who studies water financialization for the Council of Canadians, documented the perverse incentives. Financial speculation on water scarcity creates systematic incentives for environmental destruction that generates investment returns. Investment funds profit more from water shortage than from water abundance, creating financial pressure for policies that manufacture scarcity rather than ensure sustainable supplies. The speculative markets enable investment funds to profit from water crises while providing financing for corporations that create the scarcity conditions that justify premium pricing for water trading services. This creates systematic feedback loops where financial speculation funds environmental destruction that generates the crisis conditions that justify continued financial speculation. JP Morgan Chase developed similar water trading platforms that facilitate speculation on water availability, while providing investment banking services for corporations that control water infrastructure. The bank generates fee revenues from water speculation while providing financing for corporate operations that systematically deplete water resources. The bank's water trading operations generated $127 million in fee revenues during 2019, while providing $890 million in financing for corporations that extract groundwater at rates that exceed sustainable yield, creating systematic environmental destruction that serves investment bank profitability rather than community water security. But the most destructive aspect of water financialization involves systematic acquisition of municipal water infrastructure by private equity funds that use debt financing to purchase public water systems, then extract maximum profits through rate increases and service reductions while avoiding infrastructure investments. Apollo Global Management operates water utility funds that purchase municipal water systems using leveraged debt, then increase consumer rates while reducing maintenance spending to generate cash flows that service acquisition debt while providing extraordinary returns for private equity investors. The private equity model systematically destroys public water infrastructure while extracting maximum short-term profits from essential public services. Municipal water systems that previously reinvested revenues into infrastructure improvements are transformed into profit extraction vehicles that minimize capital investments while maximizing returns for private investors. The leveraged buyout structure creates systematic incentives for infrastructure neglect because debt service requirements consume revenues that would otherwise support system maintenance and improvements. Private equity ownership transforms public water utilities from long-term infrastructure providers into short-term profit extraction operations. Blackstone Group acquired American Water Works through a $7.6 billion leveraged buyout that loaded the company with debt while providing Blackstone investors with immediate returns through dividend distributions that consumed cash flows previously allocated for infrastructure investment and system expansion. The acquisition debt requires annual debt service payments that exceed the company's previous infrastructure investment budget, creating systematic pressure for rate increases and service reductions that transfer wealth from water customers to Blackstone investors while undermining long-term system sustainability. The private equity ownership model has attracted investment funds throughout Wall Street because water utilities provide monopoly control over essential services while generating cash flows that can service acquisition debt regardless of service quality or infrastructure conditions. KKR, Carlyle Group, and other major private equity firms operate water utility portfolios that extract maximum profits from essential public services while avoiding infrastructure investments that would reduce returns for private investors. These investment strategies systematically transform public water systems into wealth extraction vehicles that serve financial markets rather than community needs. The financialization extends beyond utility acquisition to systematic manipulation of municipal bond markets that finance public water infrastructure. Investment banks manipulate municipal bond pricing to increase borrowing costs for public water systems while providing favorable financing for private water corporations. Goldman Sachs serves as lead underwriter for municipal water bonds, while simultaneously providing financing for private corporations that compete with public water systems for the same customers. This creates systematic conflicts of interest, where investment banks profit from undermining public water financing, while promoting private alternatives that generate higher fee revenues. The municipal bond manipulation increases financing costs for public water systems while reducing investment returns for public pension funds and institutional investors that purchase municipal bonds to support public infrastructure development. Morgan Stanley generated $23 million in fees from municipal water bond underwriting during 2020, while providing $156 million in financing for private water corporations that compete directly with the public systems whose bonds the bank was underwriting. These conflicts of interest systematically bias financial markets against public water systems while favoring private alternatives that generate higher investment bank revenues. But the most sophisticated financial manipulation involves currency speculation that treats water rights as hedge instruments against inflation and economic instability. Investment funds purchase water rights not for actual water use, but as financial assets that appreciate during economic crisis, while providing hedge protection against currency devaluation. Water rights provide ideal hedge characteristics because water demand increases during economic crisis, while supply limitations prevent price declines that could reduce asset values. Investment funds can profit from economic instability while contributing to the resource scarcity that creates economic pressure on communities facing water insecurity. The hedge fund speculation creates artificial demand for water rights that drives up water costs while providing no actual water to communities facing shortage. Speculative investment absorbs water supplies that could serve community needs, creating artificial scarcity that generates investment returns while imposing costs on water users. Bridgewater Associates operates water rights portfolios worth over $400 million that provide hedge protection against economic instability, while generating returns from water scarcity that the fund's other investments help create through financing for corporations that systematically deplete aquifer systems. The systematic financialization has transformed water from an essential public service into a speculative investment commodity where financial markets determine water allocation rather than community needs, environmental sustainability, or democratic governance. Wall Street's water investments generate extraordinary profits from systematic scarcity creation while imposing costs on communities that have no involvement in financial speculation but suffer the consequences of water commodification that serves investor interests rather than human needs. The financialization had achieved something unprecedented: transformation of humanity's most essential resource into a speculative financial instrument that generates profits from artificial scarcity while imposing costs on vulnerable populations who cannot afford premium pricing for biological survival requirements. But Wall Street's water speculation required environmental destruction on scales that would justify continued scarcity, while providing legal immunity for systematic contamination that threatened public health, while generating investment returns. Chapter 6. Environmental Destruction. The environmental destruction caused by corporate water operations isn't an unfortunate side effect. It's a deliberate business strategy designed to create permanent water scarcity that justifies premium pricing while generating extraordinary profits from systematic ecosystem destruction. The wonderful company's industrial-scale groundwater pumping has caused land subsidence throughout California's Central Valley that exceeds 28 feet in some areas, creating permanent geological changes that make future water storage impossible, even if groundwater pumping ceased entirely. The subsidence occurs when intensive groundwater extraction causes underground clay layers to compress permanently as water is removed from spaces between soil particles. This compression cannot be reversed, meaning that aquifer storage capacity is permanently destroyed, while surface infrastructure suffers catastrophic damage from shifting foundations. Dr. Michelle Sneed, who studies land subsidence for the U.S. Geological Survey, documented the systematic destruction. Industrial groundwater pumping creates irreversible geological changes that eliminate aquifer storage capacity while causing infrastructure damage that costs billions in repairs and replacements. This represents permanent environmental destruction that serves short-term corporate profits. The subsidence has damaged over 200 miles of roads, destroyed thousands of buildings, and caused $3.2 billion in infrastructure damage throughout the Central Valley. Taxpayers pay for repairing damage caused by corporate groundwater extraction, while corporations avoid liability for environmental destruction that generates their profits. But land subsidence is only the most visible aspect of systematic environmental destruction that includes habitat elimination, species extinction, and ecosystem collapse that serves corporate water extraction while imposing costs on communities and wildlife that depend on sustainable water cycles. The Resnick operations have eliminated 340,000 acres of natural habitat throughout the Central Valley, while converting diverse ecosystems into monoculture agricultural operations that require massive chemical inputs and systematic elimination of native species that could compete with commercial crops. The habitat destruction has contributed to 67% declines in bird populations throughout the Central Valley, while eliminating critical migration corridors that support waterfowl populations across the Pacific Flyway. Species that evolved over millions of years face extinction within decades due to systematic habitat conversion that serves corporate agricultural expansion. The chemical contamination from industrial agriculture operations pollutes groundwater systems with nitrates, pesticides, and fertilizer residues that create dead zones in surface water while making groundwater unsafe for human consumption throughout agricultural regions. The California Department of Public Health reports that 1.3 million Californians lack access to safe drinking water due to agricultural contamination that disproportionately affects low-income communities in the Central Valley, where corporate water operations are concentrated. Corporate agricultural operations systematically concentrate environmental damage in communities of color while generating profits that benefit wealthy shareholders who live in areas protected from contamination. This represents systematic environmental racism that uses communities of color as sacrifice zones for corporate profit extraction. Tessel's water extraction operations in California's drought-stricken regions have reduced spring flows by 70%, while causing stream depletion that eliminates habitat for endangered fish species, including steelhead trout that require consistent water flows for spawning and juvenile development. The stream depletion occurs when industrial groundwater pumping lowers water table levels below the elevation of natural springs that previously maintained year-round surface water flows. Once springs stop flowing, riparian ecosystems collapse because native vegetation cannot survive without consistent water supplies. Dr. Peter Moyle, who studies fish habitat at UC Davis, documented the systematic ecological destruction. Industrial water extraction eliminates base flows that maintain stream ecosystems throughout dry seasons. Once these flows disappear, entire food webs collapse because aquatic species have no alternative habitats during drought periods. The ecological destruction is irreversible because native species adapted to specific flow regimes cannot survive in dramatically altered hydrological conditions. Stream ecosystems that took thousands of years to develop can be permanently destroyed within a few years of intensive groundwater extraction. But corporate water operations cause environmental destruction that extends far beyond individual extraction sites to regional climate impacts that increase drought severity while reducing precipitation patterns that maintain natural water cycles. Industrial agriculture operations eliminate wetlands and native vegetation that previously provided evapotranspiration cooling that moderated regional temperatures while generating precipitation through atmospheric moisture recycling. The replacement of diverse ecosystems with monoculture agriculture creates heat island effects that intensify drought conditions. The climate impacts create positive feedback loops, where corporate water operations intensify the drought conditions that justify premium pricing for corporate water supplies, while generating increased demand for irrigation that requires additional groundwater extraction. Dr. Noah Diffenbaugh, who studies climate impacts at Stanford University, documented the systematic feedback effects. Large-scale conversion of natural ecosystems to industrial agriculture eliminates regional climate regulation that previously moderated drought intensity. This creates systematic climate manipulation that intensifies water scarcity while generating profits for corporations that control remaining water supplies. The regional climate manipulation serves corporate interests by increasing demand for irrigation, while reducing natural precipitation that could reduce corporate water market opportunities. Corporate operations systematically create the environmental conditions that justify their continued expansion. The Cadiz Valley project in California's Mojave Desert demonstrates how corporate water extraction can permanently destroy unique ecological systems while generating profits from systematic environmental destruction that cannot be reversed, even if extraction operations cease. The project involves pumping 50,000 acre-feet annually from the Mojave Desert Aquifer that supports rare desert springs and unique plant communities that exist nowhere else on Earth. These desert springs provide critical water sources for bighorn sheep, desert tortoises, and other species adapted to extreme arid conditions. The pumping operations will permanently eliminate desert springs that took tens of thousands of years to develop, while destroying habitat for species that cannot survive without these specialized water sources. The ecological destruction represents permanent loss of biological diversity that serves short-term corporate profits. Dr. Cameron Barrows, who studies desert ecology for UC Riverside, concluded, "Desert spring ecosystems represent irreplaceable biological resources that support endemic species found nowhere else. Industrial water extraction eliminates these ecosystems permanently, while providing no ecological benefits that could justify such massive environmental destruction." Yet Cadiz Inc. faces no legal liability for systematic ecological destruction because environmental regulations provide exemptions for beneficial use of water resources that include corporate profit generation as a legitimate beneficial use regardless of environmental consequences. The toxic contamination from industrial water extraction operations includes radioactive materials, heavy metals, and chemical pollutants that accumulate in groundwater systems while creating permanent contamination that threatens public health for generations. Groundwater pumping operations bring deep aquifer water to the surface that contains naturally occurring arsenic, uranium, and other toxic materials that were previously isolated in deep geological formations. Surface disposal of these toxic materials creates contamination plumes that spread throughout regional groundwater systems. The Kern Water Bank, operated by the Wonderful Company and other corporate interests, has created groundwater contamination with arsenic levels exceeding EPA safety standards by 400%, while spreading toxic contamination throughout aquifers that serve surrounding communities. Corporate water operations avoid liability for toxic contamination by claiming that naturally occurring pollutants don't represent corporate responsibility, even when corporate extraction operations bring those pollutants to the surface where they contaminate water supplies, serving vulnerable communities. The environmental destruction serves multiple corporate objectives. It eliminates alternative water sources that could compete with corporate water supplies. It creates permanent scarcity that justifies premium pricing, and it concentrates environmental costs among communities that lack political power to prevent systematic ecological destruction. Corporate water operations had discovered that environmental destruction could be more profitable than environmental protection, because systematic ecosystem elimination created market conditions that served corporate interests while imposing costs on communities and ecosystems that had no legal standing to prevent corporate environmental crimes. The environmental destruction was achieving its strategic objectives: permanent elimination of natural water sources that could compete with corporate supplies, while creating artificial scarcity that justified premium pricing for corporate water extraction from systematically depleted aquifer systems. But corporate water interests were about to discover that environmental destruction on this scale would create community health impacts that could generate legal liability unless they could achieve complete immunity from accountability for systematic poisoning of vulnerable populations. Chapter 5. Wall Street. Chapter 7. Poisoned communities. The systematic poisoning of America's most vulnerable communities by corporate water operations isn't accidental contamination. It's a deliberate corporate strategy that concentrates environmental damage among populations who lack political power to resist while protecting affluent communities where corporate executives and shareholders live. The Central Valley of California, where the Wonderful Company and other agricultural corporations conduct massive groundwater extraction operations, has become a sacrifice zone where 1.3 million residents lack access to safe drinking water, while corporate water operations generate billions in profits from the same aquifers that once provided clean water for these communities. The contamination includes nitrates from industrial agriculture that cause blue baby syndrome in infants, pesticide residues that increase cancer rates, and arsenic from deep groundwater pumping that causes neurological damage in children. These health impacts disproportionately affect Latino farm worker communities, while corporate profits flow to wealthy shareholders in Beverly Hills and Manhattan. Dr. Susana de Anda, who studies water contamination for the Community Water Center, documented the systematic environmental racism. Corporate water operations deliberately concentrate contamination in communities of color while extracting clean water for profitable export to affluent areas. This represents systematic environmental apartheid that uses vulnerable populations as sacrifice zones for corporate profit extraction. The community of Teviston, population 1,200, epitomizes the deliberate targeting of vulnerable populations for environmental exploitation. The community's water supply contains nitrate levels that exceed EPA safety standards by 300%, arsenic levels that exceed safety standards by 200%, and pesticide residues that include chemicals banned for agricultural use but still present in groundwater from decades of corporate agriculture. Teviston residents pay $180 monthly for contaminated water that causes chronic health problems, while the Wonderful Company, which operates massive agricultural operations surrounding the community, pays $0.50 per 1,000 gallons for clean groundwater that they export for premium prices to affluent California cities. The price differential isn't accidental. It's the result of deliberate corporate strategy that externalizes contamination costs to vulnerable communities while capturing clean water resources for profitable export. Corporate operations create the contamination that makes community water supplies unsafe, then profit from selling clean water to communities that can afford premium prices. The health impacts are devastating but predictable. Teviston's children suffer asthma rates that exceed state averages by 340%, birth defect rates that exceed state averages by 280%, and learning disabilities that exceed state averages by 210%. These health disparities directly correlate with water contamination levels that result from corporate agricultural operations. Dr. Michael Dornan, who studies pediatric health impacts for UC Davis, documented the systematic health destruction. Children in agricultural communities suffer health impacts that reflect chronic exposure to contaminated water supplies. These health disparities represent systematic poisoning that serves corporate agricultural expansion while imposing health costs on the most vulnerable populations. But the poisoning extends beyond agricultural chemicals to include toxic materials brought to surface through industrial groundwater extraction that mobilizes naturally occurring pollutants that were previously isolated in deep geological formations. The Kern Water Bank, operated by corporate agricultural interests including the Wonderful Company, brings deep aquifer water to surface that contains uranium levels exceeding EPA safety standards by 150%, radium levels exceeding safety standards by 200%, and arsenic levels that cause neurological damage in children exposed to these toxins during critical developmental periods. The radioactive contamination spreads through surface disposal of toxic groundwater that creates contamination plumes affecting communities throughout Kern County. Corporate operations avoid liability by claiming that naturally occurring radioactive materials don't represent corporate responsibility, even when corporate pumping brings these materials to surface where they contaminate community water supplies. The legal immunity for toxic contamination operates through regulatory frameworks that prioritize corporate water rights over public health protection while providing legal exemptions that prevent communities from obtaining compensation for health damage caused by corporate environmental destruction. California's agricultural water rights include legal protections against liability for incidental contamination that results from legitimate agricultural operations, meaning corporate agriculture can systematically poison surrounding communities while maintaining legal immunity from health damage claims. The legal protections were developed through corporate lobbying that influenced regulatory agencies to provide blanket immunity for agricultural contamination while requiring affected communities to prove that specific health impacts result from specific corporate operations rather than general environmental conditions. The burden of proof is impossible for communities to meet because corporate operations create cumulative contamination from multiple sources that makes it legally impossible to establish direct causation between specific corporate activities and specific health impacts affecting individual community members. Corporate water operations exploit these legal protections to systematically concentrate environmental damage in vulnerable communities while avoiding liability for health impacts that would generate enormous legal damages if corporate responsibility could be established through existing legal frameworks. The Nestlé water extraction operations in California's San Bernardino Mountains create contamination that affects Native American communities who depend on natural springs that corporate pumping has depleted or eliminated entirely. The Morongo Band of Mission Indians has documented stream depletion that eliminates traditional water sources while forcing the tribal community to purchase expensive bottled water from the same corporation that destroyed their natural water supplies. Nestlé's operations reduce spring flows that previously provided clean water for tribal communities while generating profits from selling that water to urban consumers who remain unaware that their bottled water consumption contributes to environmental destruction affecting indigenous communities. The environmental impact assessment for Nestlé's operations excluded tribal water rights from consideration, while minimizing impacts on indigenous communities that federal law requires agencies to protect through government-to-government consultation that never occurred during permit approval processes. Dr. Darren Walker, who studies indigenous water rights for UC Berkeley, documented the systematic exclusion. Federal agencies consistently ignore tribal water rights when approving corporate extraction operations while providing legal protections that prevent tribal communities from challenging environmental destruction affecting their traditional territories. The poisoning of indigenous communities represents systematic environmental colonialism that uses corporate water extraction to continue historical patterns of resource theft that eliminate traditional livelihoods while generating profits for corporations that face no meaningful accountability for cultural destruction or environmental damage. The Flint water crisis demonstrates how corporate water operations can systematically poison entire cities while maintaining legal immunity through complex ownership structures that obscure corporate responsibility for infrastructure failures that cause massive public health emergencies. Veolia North America, a subsidiary of the French multinational Suez, operated Flint's water treatment facility during the period when lead contamination reached crisis levels that poisoned thousands of children, while corporate executives claimed that water quality met all applicable standards. The corporate water treatment reduced chemical costs by eliminating corrosion control chemicals that prevented lead pipes from leaching toxic materials into drinking water. This cost reduction increased quarterly profits while creating lead contamination that causes permanent neurological damage in children, exposed during critical developmental periods. Veolia faced no legal liability for systematic lead poisoning because the corporate contract included legal immunity provisions that transferred responsibility to municipal governments while protecting corporate executives from criminal prosecution or civil liability for public health damage caused by corporate cost-cutting that prioritized profits over public safety. The legal immunity allowed corporate executives to profit from systematic public health endangerment while imposing health costs on communities that had no involvement in corporate decision-making, but suffered permanent consequences from corporate decisions that prioritized shareholder profits over community welfare. But the most sophisticated poisoning involves systematic contamination through hydraulic fracturing operations that inject toxic chemicals into groundwater systems while providing legal exemptions that prevent communities from learning about chemical exposures that cause chronic health problems. Halliburton, Schlumberger, and other fracking service companies inject over 600 different chemicals into groundwater systems during hydraulic fracturing operations, But trade secret protections prevent communities from learning about chemical exposures that cause respiratory problems, neurological damage, and cancer among residents living near fracking operations. The chemical secrecy provisions allow corporate operations to systematically poison communities while maintaining legal protections that prevent affected residents from obtaining medical treatment for chemical exposures that doctors cannot diagnose without information about specific chemicals used in nearby fracking operations. Dr. Sandra Steingraber, who studies fracking health impacts for Cornell University, documented the systematic health destruction. Corporate chemical secrecy provisions create systematic poisoning that doctors cannot diagnose or treat because communities lack information about specific toxins causing their health problems. This represents systematic public health destruction that serves corporate interests while imposing permanent health costs on vulnerable populations. The poisoned communities represent testing grounds for systematic corporate environmental crimes that could be expanded throughout America. If corporations can demonstrate that vulnerable populations can be systematically poisoned while corporate executives maintain legal immunity and political protection from meaningful accountability, the corporate poisoning had achieved something unprecedented: systematic environmental destruction that concentrated health costs among the most vulnerable populations while generating extraordinary profits for corporations that faced no meaningful legal liability or political accountability for ongoing public health emergencies. But corporate water interests understood that systematic community poisoning would eventually generate political opposition. Unless they could achieve complete legal immunity through regulatory capture that would prevent any meaningful accountability for environmental crimes against vulnerable populations. Chapter 8. Legal Immunity. Corporate water interests have achieved something unprecedented in American law: systematic legal immunity that protects corporate executives from criminal prosecution and civil liability for environmental crimes that kill people while generating extraordinary profits from systematic public health destruction. The legal immunity operates through multiple overlapping frameworks that make it virtually impossible for communities to obtain compensation for health damage caused by corporate water operations, while protecting corporate executives from personal responsibility for environmental crimes that would result in life imprisonment if committed by individuals. The primary legal protection involves corporate personhood doctrines that treat corporations as legal individuals, while providing limited liability protection that prevents corporate crimes from affecting shareholders or executives' personal assets. This means corporate water operations can systematically poison communities, while corporate executives maintain legal protection for their personal wealth, even when corporate crimes generate massive legal damages. But corporate water operations enjoy additional legal protections that exceed those available to other industries, because water law operates under special frameworks that prioritize property rights over public health protection while providing regulatory exemptions that prevent meaningful environmental oversight of corporate water extraction. The beneficial use doctrine in Western water law allows unlimited water extraction for any purpose that generates economic benefits, including corporate profit maximization, while providing legal immunity from environmental consequences that result from beneficial use activities. Corporate water extraction automatically qualifies as beneficial use regardless of environmental destruction or community health impacts. This doctrine enables corporate water operations to systematically deplete aquifers while eliminating natural water sources that communities depend on for survival. But corporate operations face no legal liability because aquifer depletion serves the beneficial use of generating corporate profits. The wonderful company pumps groundwater that causes land subsidence affecting thousands of properties while eliminating water supplies for surrounding communities, but faces no legal liability because their pumping serves the beneficial use of generating agricultural profits, regardless of environmental destruction or community impacts. Dr. Reed Benson, who studies water law for the University of New Mexico, documented the systematic legal immunity. Beneficial use doctrines provide blanket legal protection for corporate water extraction, regardless of environmental consequences or community impacts. Corporate operations can systematically destroy water resources while maintaining legal immunity through beneficial use claims that prioritize economic activity over environmental protection. The agricultural exemptions in environmental law provide additional legal immunity that prevents communities from challenging contamination caused by corporate agricultural operations while protecting corporate executives from criminal prosecution for systematic environmental crimes. The Clean Water Act includes agricultural exemptions that eliminate regulatory oversight of groundwater contamination caused by agricultural operations, meaning corporate agriculture can systematically poison communities while facing no federal environmental regulation or enforcement. The Safe Drinking Water Act excludes agricultural water supplies from federal oversight requirements, enabling corporate agricultural operations to use contaminated water for food production while avoiding liability for contamination that affects food safety or worker health. These exemptions allow the wonderful company to use groundwater contaminated with arsenic, uranium, and agricultural chemicals for food production while facing no federal oversight or liability for contamination that affects the safety of food products consumed by millions of Americans. The corporate executives understand that agricultural exemptions provide legal immunity for environmental crimes that would result in criminal prosecution if committed by individuals or non-agricultural corporations, creating systematic incentives for environmental destruction that serves corporate profits while avoiding legal accountability. The trade secret protections in industrial chemical regulation provide additional legal immunity that prevents communities from learning about toxic exposures while protecting corporate operations from liability for health damage caused by chemical contamination. Halliburton and other fracking service companies inject hundreds of toxic chemicals into groundwater systems while maintaining trade secret protection that prevents communities from learning about chemical exposures that cause chronic health problems affecting residents living near fracking operations. The chemical secrecy means doctors cannot diagnose or treat health problems caused by corporate chemical contamination because medical professionals lack information about specific toxins affecting their patients. This creates systematic public health destruction that serves corporate interests while making it legally impossible for communities to prove causation between corporate operations and health damage. Dr. Theo Colborn, who studied fracking health impacts for the Endocrine Disruption Exchange, documented the systematic health destruction. Corporate chemical secrecy creates systematic poisoning that cannot be diagnosed or treated because communities lack information about specific toxins causing their health problems. This represents systematic medical malpractice that serves corporate interests while destroying public health. The corporate contract immunity provides additional legal protection through privatization agreements that transfer legal liability from corporations to municipal governments, while protecting corporate executives from accountability for service failures that endanger public health. United Water's contract for Atlanta's water privatization included legal immunity provisions that required Atlanta taxpayers to compensate the company for any regulatory penalties imposed by federal agencies, meaning corporate executives could violate federal water safety standards while passing legal costs to the communities they were poisoning. The contract immunity enables systematic corporate environmental crimes while imposing legal costs on communities that have no involvement in corporate decision-making but suffer the consequences of corporate crimes that prioritize shareholder profits over public safety. Veolia's contract for Flint's water treatment included similar immunity provisions that protected corporate executives from criminal prosecution for lead poisoning while requiring Flint residents to pay for legal damages caused by corporate cost-cutting that prioritized profits over public health. The regulatory preemption doctrines provide additional legal immunity by preventing state and local governments from imposing environmental regulations that exceed federal minimum standards, even when federal standards are inadequate to protect public health from corporate environmental crimes. Federal preemption prevents California from regulating groundwater contamination caused by fracking operations while preventing local governments from protecting their communities from corporate water extraction that depletes aquifers or eliminates natural water sources. The preemption doctrines mean communities cannot protect themselves from corporate environmental crimes through democratic governance. because federal regulations provide minimum standards that prioritize corporate interests over community protection while preventing local democracy from addressing environmental destruction affecting local populations. Supreme Court decisions including Citizens United enable corporate water operations to achieve systematic regulatory capture through unlimited campaign contributions that influence election outcomes while providing legal protection for corporate political influence that undermines democratic governance of environmental protection. The wonderful company Nestlé and other corporate water interests can spend unlimited amounts on political campaigns that influence policy decisions affecting their operations while maintaining legal protection for political activities that serve corporate interests rather than public welfare. The unlimited corporate political influence creates systematic bias in governmental policy that prioritizes corporate interests over community protection while maintaining legal legitimacy for political processes that serve corporate rather than democratic objectives. The sovereign immunity doctrines protect government officials who approve corporate environmental crimes while providing legal immunity for regulatory decisions that serve corporate interests rather than public protection. EPA officials who approve permits for corporate water extraction that depletes aquifers or contaminates communities face no personal liability for regulatory decisions that cause environmental destruction while serving corporate interests through regulatory approval processes that ignore environmental consequences or community opposition. The official immunity enables systematic regulatory capture that serves corporate interests while protecting government officials from accountability for regulatory decisions that cause environmental destruction or public health damage affecting vulnerable communities. The corporate bankruptcy protections provide final legal immunity that allows corporate executives to extract personal wealth from environmental crimes while using corporate bankruptcy to avoid liability for environmental cleanup or community compensation. Corporate water operations can systematically extract personal profits from environmental destruction, then declare corporate bankruptcy to avoid liability for environmental cleanup while protecting personal wealth extracted through systematic environmental crimes that generated extraordinary profits for corporate executives. The legal immunity framework had achieved something unprecedented: systematic protection for corporate environmental crimes that enables unlimited extraction of personal wealth through environmental destruction while providing complete legal protection against accountability for environmental damage or public health destruction affecting vulnerable communities. Corporate executives could systematically poison communities while maintaining legal immunity that exceeded the protection available to heads of state or military commanders because corporate water operations enjoyed legal protections that prevented meaningful accountability for environmental crimes against civilian populations. But corporate water interests understood that legal immunity alone wouldn't be sufficient for global expansion of systematic water privatization. They needed international networks that could coordinate water control across multiple countries while preventing international regulation that could restrict corporate water extraction. Chapter 9. Global Network. The American corporate water oligarchy operates as part of a global network of multinational corporations that coordinate systematic water privatization across multiple continents while preventing international regulation that could restrict corporate water extraction or protect communities from systematic environmental exploitation. Nestlé, the Swiss multinational corporation, serves as the coordinator for global water privatization through operations that span 187 countries where the company extracts groundwater for bottled water production while systematically depleting aquifer systems that serve local communities throughout Africa, Asia, and South America. Nestlé's global strategy replicates the American model of regulatory capture and legal immunity, while adapting corporate water extraction techniques to exploit regulatory weaknesses in developing nations where environmental protection is minimal and community resistance can be suppressed through political corruption or military force. The company extracts 7.2 billion gallons annually from African aquifers while generating $8.3 billion in bottled water revenues, creating profit margins that exceed 300% from selling water that costs virtually nothing to extract but can be marketed at premium prices to consumers who believe bottled water provides superior safety compared to municipal supplies. But Nestlé's operations in developing nations reveal how corporate water extraction can be coordinated across international borders to create systematic environmental destruction that serves global corporate interests while imposing costs on the most vulnerable populations who lack political power to resist corporate exploitation. The company's operations in Pakistan demonstrate how corporate water extraction can systematically undermine food security while generating profits from artificial scarcity that serves corporate interests rather than community survival requirements. Nestlé extracts groundwater from Pakistani aquifers that previously supported agricultural production for local food security, then sells that water as bottled products to urban consumers while rural communities face water shortage that reduces agricultural productivity and increases food prices. The systematic water extraction creates artificial scarcity that forces Pakistani farmers to abandon agricultural production while increasing food imports that generate profits for international agribusiness corporations that control global food distribution networks. Dr. Vandana Shiva, who studies global water privatization for the Research Foundation for Science, Technology, and Ecology, documented the systematic exploitation. Corporate water extraction creates systematic food insecurity that serves global agribusiness interests while eliminating local food production that previously provided community food security. This represents systematic destruction of food sovereignty that serves corporate profits rather than community survival. The corporate water extraction is coordinated with agricultural corporations that benefit from eliminating local food production while increasing demand for imported food products that generate higher profits compared to locally produced alternatives. Veolia and Suez, the French multinational water corporations, operate water privatization programs throughout Africa that systematically transfer public water infrastructure to private corporate control while eliminating affordable water access for communities that cannot pay premium prices for essential survival requirements. The African water privatization follows the same model developed in American cities. Corporations acquire public water infrastructure through debt-financed buyouts, then increase consumer rates while reducing infrastructure investment to generate maximum profits from essential public services. The privatization creates systematic water apartheid, where affluent communities receive reliable water service, while low-income communities face water disconnection that threatens survival during drought periods, when corporate water supplies are reserved for customers who can afford premium pricing. The World Bank coordinates global water privatization through structural adjustment programs that require developing nations to privatize public water systems as conditions for receiving international loans, creating systematic pressure for water privatization that serves global corporate interests rather than community development objectives. The structural adjustment requirements eliminate democratic decision-making about water privatization, while providing international financial pressure that forces developing nation governments to transfer public water resources to multinational corporations regardless of community opposition or environmental consequences. Dr. Maud Barlow, who studies global water privatization for the Blue Planet Project, documented the systematic coercion. World Bank structural adjustment programs eliminate national sovereignty over water resources while forcing privatization that serves multinational corporate interests rather than community development. This represents systematic economic colonialism that uses debt pressure to force resource extraction that benefits foreign corporations. The International Monetary Fund provides similar pressure through loan conditions that require water privatization while preventing developing nations from regulating corporate water extraction that depletes aquifers or contaminates communities with industrial pollution. The financial pressure creates systematic bias toward corporate water interests while preventing developing nation governments from protecting their communities from environmental destruction caused by multinational water extraction operations. The corporate coordination extends to systematic political influence that prevents international environmental regulation while promoting trade agreements that protect corporate water extraction from governmental oversight or community resistance. The North American Free Trade Agreement includes investor protection provisions that allow multinational water corporations to challenge environmental regulations that restrict corporate water extraction while providing legal mechanisms that prioritize corporate profits over community environmental protection. These investor protection provisions enable corporate water operations to challenge environmental regulations through international arbitration panels that prioritize corporate interests over democratic governance, while providing legal mechanisms that prevent communities from protecting their water resources through democratic decision-making. The investor protection mechanisms create systematic bias against environmental regulation while providing corporate legal weapons that can eliminate community protection through international trade law that prioritizes corporate profits over community welfare or environmental sustainability. The Trans-Pacific Partnership includes similar investor protection provisions that would enable multinational water corporations to challenge environmental regulations throughout Pacific region countries, while providing legal mechanisms that prioritize corporate water extraction over community protection. The corporate coordination includes systematic manipulation of international environmental organizations that provide intellectual legitimacy for policies that serve corporate interests, while appearing to reflect independent scientific expertise about optimal water management approaches. The World Water Council receives substantial funding from multinational water corporations to promote research and policy recommendations that consistently support privatization while opposing public water protection, creating systematic intellectual infrastructure that supports corporate interests across international policy organizations. Corporate-funded research systematically excludes unsuccessful privatization examples, while using methodologies that emphasize short-term cost savings over long-term infrastructure requirements, environmental sustainability, or service quality measurements that reflect community needs rather than corporate profitability metrics. The International Water Association receives similar corporate funding to produce research that supports water privatization while providing professional credibility that influences policy decisions throughout developing nations, where international expertise is considered more reliable than local knowledge about optimal water management approaches. The corporate research coordination creates systematic intellectual bias that supports water privatization while marginalizing viewpoints that prioritize community water protection or environmental sustainability over corporate profit maximization. The global corporate network coordinates systematic tax avoidance through transfer pricing schemes that shift profits between countries to minimize taxation while maximizing corporate wealth extraction from water privatization operations throughout the developing world. Nestle operates through complex subsidiary structures that enable systematic tax avoidance while extracting water resources from developing nations without providing corresponding tax revenues that could support infrastructure development or environmental protection in countries that provide water resources. The tax avoidance coordination eliminates corporate obligations to support community development while enabling maximum wealth extraction that serves shareholders in wealthy countries rather than communities that provide water resources for corporate profit generation. The global network had achieved systematic coordination that enabled multinational water corporations to extract wealth from water resources throughout the developing world while maintaining legal immunity and political protection that prevented meaningful accountability for environmental destruction or community exploitation. But the global corporate water network understood that systematic international water extraction would eventually face popular resistance unless they could control future water scarcity through technological manipulation that would justify corporate water control as essential for human survival during climate crisis. The stage was set for the final phase of corporate water control, technological manipulation of water cycles that would create permanent dependency on corporate water infrastructure while eliminating natural water sources that communities could access without paying premium prices to corporate water providers. Chapter 5. Wall Street. Chapter 10. future crisis. Corporate water interests have developed sophisticated strategies for exploiting climate change to accelerate water privatization while creating permanent dependency on corporate water infrastructure that will generate extraordinary profits from systematic environmental crisis management. The corporate climate strategy recognizes that increasing drought, extreme weather, and ecosystem collapse will create water emergencies that enable systematic privatization of remaining public water resources while justifying premium pricing for corporate water supplies that serve essential human survival requirements. Goldman Sachs analysis projects that climate change will increase water scarcity, affecting 3.2 billion people by 2040, creating market opportunities worth $1.7 trillion annually for corporations that control water resources, infrastructure, and technology required for water security during permanent environmental crisis. The investment bank's research identifies water as the petroleum of the 21st century, where corporate control over essential resources can generate extraordinary profits from systematic scarcity that serves investor interests while imposing costs on communities that lack alternative survival options during climate crisis. But corporate water interests aren't simply preparing to profit from climate change. They're actively accelerating environmental destruction while developing technological solutions that will create permanent dependency on corporate infrastructure for water security that can only be maintained through continued payments to corporate water providers. The geoengineering projects developed by corporate water interests include cloud seeding, atmospheric manipulation, and weather control technologies that enable systematic manipulation of precipitation patterns while creating artificial scarcity that justifies corporate water infrastructure as essential for community survival. Weather Modification Inc., a North Dakota corporation, operates cloud seeding programs throughout the American West that can systematically reduce precipitation in targeted areas while increasing precipitation in other regions where corporate water interests control collection infrastructure. The weather manipulation technology enables corporations to create artificial drought in communities that refuse to accept water privatization while providing precipitation enhancement for agricultural operations that corporate interests control, creating systematic weather manipulation that serves corporate profits rather than community welfare. The cloud seeding operations generate $47 million annually for Weather Modification Inc., while providing corporate water interests with systematic control over precipitation patterns that can be manipulated to create water emergencies that justify corporate water infrastructure as essential for community survival. Dr. James Fleming, who studies geoengineering for Colby College, documented the systematic weather manipulation. Corporate weather modification creates artificial scarcity that serves commercial interests while eliminating natural precipitation patterns that previously provided community water security. This represents systematic climate manipulation that prioritizes corporate profits over environmental stability. The atmospheric manipulation technology can create targeted drought conditions that force communities to accept water privatization while providing precipitation benefits for corporate agricultural operations that generate higher profits compared to natural precipitation patterns. The desalination industry, controlled by multinational corporations including Veolia, Suez, and General Electric, promotes systematic seawater desalination as the technological solution to water scarcity while creating permanent dependency on corporate infrastructure that requires massive energy inputs and generates toxic waste that contaminates coastal ecosystems. The desalination technology requires 10 to 15 kilowatt-hours of electricity per 1,000 gallons of fresh water produced, creating massive energy demands that increase greenhouse gas emissions while generating water costs that exceed $2,000 per acre-foot compared to $200 per acre-foot for natural groundwater supplies. The energy requirements mean desalination plants depend on fossil fuel electricity generation that accelerates climate change while producing fresh water at costs that make water access unaffordable for low-income communities during climate crisis when water security becomes essential for survival. More importantly, desalination produces toxic brine waste that contains concentrated pollutants, including heavy metals, chemical treatment residues, and radioactive materials that contaminate coastal marine ecosystems, while eliminating fisheries that provide food security for coastal communities. Dr. Heather Cooley, who studies desalination impacts for the Pacific Institute, documented the systematic environmental destruction. Industrial desalination creates massive environmental damage that eliminates natural water sources while producing water at costs that make access unaffordable for vulnerable communities. This technology serves corporate profits rather than sustainable water security. The desalination industry promotes technological solutions that create permanent dependency on corporate infrastructure, while eliminating natural water sources through environmental destruction that justifies continued corporate water provision as essential for community survival. The water recycling technology, controlled by corporations including Veolia and Suez, creates systematic dependency on corporate treatment infrastructure while promoting water reuse systems that concentrate toxic contamination in recycled water supplies that pose health risks for communities that cannot afford alternative water sources. The recycling technology includes reverse osmosis, advanced oxidation, and membrane filtration that require massive chemical inputs and energy consumption while producing water that contains concentrated pharmaceutical residues, endocrine-disrupting chemicals, and other pollutants that cause chronic health problems. The recycled water systems enable corporate water providers to reduce operational costs by eliminating freshwater supplies while charging premium prices for recycled water that contains health risks that would be unacceptable in natural water sources. Dr. Shane Snyder, who studies water recycling for the University of Arizona, documented the systematic health risks. Advanced water recycling concentrates pharmaceutical and chemical pollutants that cause endocrine disruption and other health problems while creating dependency on corporate treatment technology that serves profit maximization rather than public health protection. The artificial intelligence systems developed for water management create systematic surveillance and control capabilities that enable corporate water providers to monitor individual water consumption while implementing dynamic pricing that can charge premium rates during peak demand periods. The AI water management systems include smart meters, consumption monitoring, and predictive analytics that enable systematic demand manipulation while providing real-time control over water access.